All right, hello everybody and welcome to EPA's Computational Toxicology Communities of Practice. My name is Sammy Hamp. I'm a student contractor here at NCCT, and today we will be hearing from Dr. Kathie Dionisio about the Chemicals and Products Database. I just want to give everyone a quick reminder to please mute your phone. You can do that by hitting *6 or #6. If you have any issues with the audio, please let me know in the chat box, and hopefully at the end we'll have some time to answer questions. And with that, we'll hand it over to Dr. Dionisio.
Thank you. All right, thank you everybody for listening in, I guess, not being here. Today I am here to talk about the Chemical and Products Database, or CPDat. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Catherine Phillips and Kristen Isaacs, who are here in the room with me at EPA. They have both contributed a huge amount of effort towards the CPDat database and all of the data that is behind it, and are here to help answer questions. CPDat represents a large effort with many, many people involved in contributing, as with any large research effort. So there's a lot of pieces and various folks who are experts on different pieces. The disclaimer for any presentation we give externally: the views expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the U.S. EPA. So sort of talking about, what are we here, what was our motivation for this work that we've done? Before we dive into what is CPDat, why are we working on this? In June 2016, Congress passed the Frank-Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act, which amended the Toxic Substances Control Act. And this was kind of a big deal for the EPA. There were a lot of new requirements that the Lautenberg Act required of EPA, and sort of a new role that EPA was going to play in managing chemical safety. So under the amended TSCA, there's now a mandatory requirement for the EPA to evaluate existing chemicals with clear and enforceable deadlines. There's a mandate to do risk-based chemical assessments, and a mandate for increased...
Sorry, do you have an HDMI for it on there?
Yeah. One sec, we're trying to display.
Get this for everyone in the room, sorry.
Sorry, everybody, we're trying to display in the room. And a mandate for increased public transparency of the information that's being used in implementing these laws. So our role here as ORD, the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics is the office that actually implements the Toxic Substances Control Act. But here in the Office of Research and Development, we can play a role in providing the data that we have available from our research efforts that will help the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics to do their job and to do their job better. So specifically what I'm here to talk about today, and what myself and my colleagues work on here in ORD, is exposure and all information related to exposure and exposure potential of a chemical substance. In 2012, some of my colleagues, led by Dr. Peter Agegi, published a paper looking at data availability for data critical to exposure estimation, and essentially showing that the data are relatively limited. If you think about the fact that, as stated on the previous slide, there were 67,000 chemicals on the TSCA inventory, and then you look at this plot on the right, there's a limited amount of information for those 67,000 chemicals. The category of data that has the most information is production volume, but there's still only data on 14,000 of the 67,000 chemicals. If you look specifically at what, again, we're going to talk about today, use category, what we mean by use category is how is the chemical used? What types of products is the chemical used in? What function does the chemical have in the products that it's used in? When you look at use category data, there is only data on 8,000 of those 67,000 chemicals. So quite a bit of information that we're lacking when we're trying to look at how people are potentially exposed to chemicals. So the solution, or our attempt at solving this problem, has evolved into the Chemical and Products Database. As I was starting to describe, information on generic chemical use and the chemical composition of consumer products is needed to support modeling-based characterization of population chemical exposures. There is data available from a variety of sources, but that data is widely dispersed and often difficult to access. The data may be available in a PDF. That's hard to extract the data out of. The data may be in inconsistent formats coming from different sources, et cetera. In addition, there were multiple EPA efforts that started to tackle this problem from different angles, and so we felt the need to harmonize and aggregate all of the data from those various efforts to get at this question of why is a chemical in a product and what types of products and what types of uses is the chemical associated with. So we now can say that we have collected the data and pulled the data from a variety of these sources, both EPA and otherwise, together into an integrated relational database of chemical and consumer product information that we call CPDat. The CPDat data is currently available in a couple of different ways, which I will describe later in the presentation. But the main way that we surface the data is through the CompTox Chemicals dashboard, which I believe was the Communities of Practice presentation from last month. So if you want more detail on the dashboard, you can go onto the Communities of Practice webpage and watch that video or the recording. That's up on the webpage to learn more about the dashboard. So the CPDat database provides a means to organize and disseminate chemical and product information. It is comprised of chemical use and consumer product composition data from a number of public sources. We have organized the data around a set of consumer product use categories, which have been optimized for exposure modeling. And the goal is to incorporate the exposure and exposure potential from near-field sources into health characterization for risk-based prioritization. Through the database and related efforts, we have a goal of having a sustainable way to organize, update, and disseminate the data, which is what I'll be talking about today. So let's talk about what is CPDat. As I said, CPDat is an effort that we've pulled together various EPA and external databases to try and harmonize data and link pieces of data together for more efficient use and analysis. The first piece of CPDat is what we call CPCat. This is actually a database that was the subject of another Communities of Practice webinar a few years ago, but I did look, and that talk is also still available on the Communities of Practice website. So if you're interested in more detail on that, go ahead and watch that talk. What the CPCat database was one of our initial efforts at a broad categorization of chemical use. So pulling together any information we could find on how are chemicals used. It could be the functional use of the chemical, could be the therapeutic use, is this chemical used as a particular pharmaceutical. It included consumer product-based uses and industrial process uses. But the categorizations were broad. The industrial process use, all we might be able to say is that this chemical is used in manufacturing of textiles. So it gave us some information about how chemicals are used, but often was a broad categorization of use. The CPCPDB database was another EPA effort that focused on bringing together information specifically on consumer products and consumer product formulations. So when we say formulation, we mean products that you purchase at Target or your store of choice and use up in your home, things that often come in a bottle and need to be replenished, like laundry detergent, cleaning spray, toothpaste. And the information that was pulled together for CPDB was based on MSDS, material safety data sheets, provided typically by the manufacturer of the product that describe for any given product what chemicals are in the product and often the weight fraction or quantity of the chemical in the product. This was important as this type of quantitative data allows us to, parameterize a direct input to our models of exposure from use of consumer products. Another piece of data that comes into CPDat is what we call ingredient lists. You know, sometimes we may have the material safety data sheet available for a product. Sometimes we don't, but we may have an ingredient list. So if you think about a number of products you use in your home, you turn that product over, you turn the bottle around and look at the back, and there's a list of ingredients. These are the chemicals in the product, typically listed by chemical name. This information, though it doesn't provide us that quantitative data, is still helpful. It still tells us what chemicals might be in the product. And there was an effort here at EPA by some of my colleagues to create a model to predict weight fractions or bound the weight fractions of the chemicals listed as ingredients in the products based on structured reporting rules. So in some cases, for certain types of products, the manufacturers are mandated to list the ingredients in weight fraction order. And with knowing the parameters that they're required to report their ingredient lists under, we're able to set bounds on the weight fraction of various ingredients. So that's another piece of data that contributes to the CPDat data. The fourth piece of data that comes into CPDat is the functional use data. So functional use being, you know, what is the role of the chemical in the product? Is this chemical serving as the solvent or the fragrance in my cleaning product? Sometimes we have information about reported to us on the functional use. You know, a product manufacturer may say these are the chemicals in the cleaning product and this is the functional role of each of those chemicals in this particular cleaning product. Sometimes we have more general information. You know, a chemical supplier might say for each of these chemicals these are the various functional roles that it may serve. Lots of different types of information. As with the weight fractions, we often have both reported information, information that a manufacturer or chemical supplier tells us about the chemical and the functional use, or we may have modeled information about the potential functional use of the chemical dependent on the product that it's in or dependent on it, or based on its structure. Lastly, and the last piece of data coming into CPDat is measured data. So there's been a large effort by colleagues here at EPA to do targeted and non-targeted measurement of chemicals in consumer products at the most basic level. This is taking products, grinding them up or dissolving them in a laboratory, and looking for chemicals to say what chemicals are in the products. This is really beneficial for us for a number of reasons. It gets at chemicals that may be in a product but not listed on the ingredient list or on the MSDS. You know, you can have contaminants in your product. You can have chemicals that migrate in from the packaging of the product. And these things are not reported as ingredients. They're not an intentionally added ingredient. So this laboratory measurement helps us to get at that. It also helps in the case where we don't have information on the ingredients of products. Articles don't have as much reporting on, you know, what chemicals went into the product, so we don't have as much information there, and that's where this targeted and non-targeted measurement can help us. I should have said at the beginning, you know, you may have seen on the previous 5 slides, for each of these different data sets, there are associated peer-reviewed public journal articles available that describe each of these efforts in more detail. So you can go back to any of those articles to get at the details of the different types of data. I also want to mention that all of the data that I've described that goes into CPDat is publicly available data, which is why we're able to provide it publicly. It either was obtained from a public source or it is, for example, modeled data that has been published and is available publicly through that means as well. So everything in CPDat is public. And lastly, wanted to say that though I've described these sort of 5 core pieces as contributing to CPDat, CPDat is a dynamic database. It is constantly evolving. We are still actively working on CPDat. And what I've described here is the sort of state of CPDat as of describing the current public version of CPDat available on the dashboard and through various download options. The current publicly available version of the data set is described in a paper that you see here that was published earlier this year. It provides all of the different, or it pulls together all of the different pieces that I described. But a little bit later, I'm going to talk about, how the database is evolving and what we have coming hopefully soon in terms of another public release of an updated version of the data. So important to know that it's not static. It's not going to stay where it is. We're constantly improving and adding to the data. So if you think about CPDat, again, in terms of at the point of the latest public release, so what is available in the dashboard, what is available in the public downloads, and what is described in the paper, CPDat covers between 30 and 60,000 chemicals. I'll explain in a couple slides why that chemical range is so broad, and it really depends on how you count chemicals. It includes information on 16,000 consumer products, much of them with weight fraction data, and I think almost all of them with, at least with ingredient data, or I guess all of them with ingredient data. And it categorizes these consumer products into around 200 consumer product categories, in addition to those broad categorizations of chemical use that were described earlier. So an important piece of CPDat are the information linkages. An important motivation of why we've pulled this data together is that we have data coming in from many different venues, not just different sources, but different types of data that sometimes seem, not connected, but in fact are able to be connected. So we've tried to bring it all together and link the data as appropriate. The two main, pieces of our data linkage are the product to chemical linkage. So when you see that DTX SID, that's referring to the chemical, and I'll explain that in the next slide. But we have this, I guess I can't point. Sorry, I can't do a pointer, I don't think. But the functional use information may be directly related to the product and its ingredients. It may also just be linked to the chemical. The product obviously is linked to the chemical in terms of what chemicals are contained in the product. And the product is also associated with a product category, which I've sort of alluded to. When we talk about product categories or consumer product categories, in our efforts at research and modeling, and also often in, regulatory efforts, we're more concerned with the category of the product. We're more concerned with what chemicals are in toothpaste and how are we potentially exposed to chemicals by using toothpaste. More so than we're concerned with what chemicals are in Colgate versus Crest. Somebody is concerned about that. Colgate and Crest are, but we're more interested in this more generalized estimation. So it's the linking of specific products to the category, the product category that they're contained in is a critical piece for us, and then we sort of aggregate our data by product category. So I'll talk about the product category a little bit more to give you a little bit more detail. Product use categories, or we call them PUCs, group products based on meeting a common need and having similar routes of exposure. I described earlier that the PUCs have been designed to be optimized for exposure modeling. There's lots of different ways to categorize products if you start looking on the internet. But we needed a way to categorize them for exposure modeling. The fact that your air freshener is a spray versus a plug-in changes the routes of exposure and changes your exposure potential for that product. So those types of pieces of information are important to us in categorizing the products. So the product categories are, we've developed a system where they're a hierarchical system with three main levels. You can see the general category at the top, going down to a product family and a product type. General categories, there are about a dozen general categories, things like personal care and cleaning products and those then are refined down to the next level, under cleaning products and household care. You may have dishwasher and dishes, and then under that you may have dish soap. Similarly, under personal care, you may have a category for dental care and then a category for toothpaste. So this hierarchy allows us to aggregate up when necessary. And we'll also say that the PUCs are consistent with the harmonized OECD system of product categorizations for chemical reporting, so can be mapped over to those if that's helpful for your effort. These PUCs are going to be described in a paper that Kristen Isaacs has led that is being submitted to a journal in the coming weeks. This is a figure from Kristen's upcoming paper that is just to give you an idea of the sort of scope of products in the current public version of the database. The size of the circles represents the number of products. So you can see that, the most products we have are in that personal care category, and probably second to that is the cleaning and household care products. This is partly due to the fact that, personal care products are required to report the ingredients that are contained in the product. So therefore, there's more information available on personal care products. It's easier to get at. We are actively working on expanding our product scope and expanding the number of products in some of these other categories where we have not as many products available. So now I just want to talk a little bit about what we call the DTX SID, or the way that we identify chemicals, because this has evolved into a really critical piece of the database, though I don't know that any of us ever expected that to be. Those who listened to last month's webinar from Tony Williams may have heard this discussed. The DTX SID is a chemical identifier that has been developed by colleagues here at EPA in the National Center for Computational Toxicology to uniquely identify chemicals by their chemical structure. Correct chemical identification is important for a number of reasons, and it is also difficult. Those who are familiar with chemistry and have worked with chemical data in the past know that there are many ways for a chemical to be named, all of which may refer to the same chemical structure or may refer to different chemical structures, though the names may be similar. You can obviously have misspelled chemical names. Chemical names are difficult to understand. To write out misspellings of chemical names are hardly uncommon. If you think about the CAS system for identifying chemicals, that is also an imperfect system. There are sometimes multiple CAS for a single chemical structure. Sometimes CAS get retired, quote unquote, and are no longer used, but still, in the past, if you have historical data referred to a specific chemical structure. We've also found in our data that sometimes we may have conflicts. We may have a material safety data sheet that gives us a CAS and a chemical name, but we really don't think that the CAS and the chemical name are really talking about the same chemical structure. So these are all pieces of information that are really important in allowing us to provide a clean data set for people to use for analysis. So these are all things that we need to take into account when we're providing data on chemicals. So this DTX SID, like I said, provides a unique identifier for each chemical structure. Our goal in...
Okay. I would just like to remind everyone to please mute their lines. You can do that by hitting #6.
Our goal is to map all of the chemical information in CPDat to one of these DTX SIDs so that we have a very clear accounting of what chemical we're referring to when we say that ethylparaben is in the foundation that you use on your face every morning. This also gets back to why I gave that range of number of chemicals in CPDat. In the current public version of the database, if you count chemicals by unique CAS, we have 49,000 chemicals, we have 68,000 unique chemical names, and then we have 31,000 unique substances or unique structures if you count by DTX SID. But it's important to note that we also have 27,000 substances that are not yet curated and assigned to a DTX SID. That chemical curation process is often a brute force, manual process that takes some time, so that is ongoing. We add to that every day. But I put these numbers here partly because we often are asked in presentations what these numbers are, so that's why I just put them out there. But to show that this chemical curation process is a really, really big piece of providing the exposure data in a way that we can trust the data, we can trust that we when we're looking at information on a chemical, we're actually all talking about the same chemical. So let's move into how do we access CPDat? How do we actually get at all of this data that we've described? The main way to access the data in CPDat is through the Tox Chemicals dashboard, which again was the subject of last month's webinar. If you go to the Tox dashboard homepage, there are now a few different ways to search the dashboard. And there's also, up on the menu bar up at the top, there's a downloads link. If you go to that downloads link and you scroll down towards the bottom of the page, you'll see a link for the chemical and products database. This is one option for how to access the data. If you download this, click on this link and download, it is a zip file of a handful of CSVs that all contain identifiers that would allow you to very easily merge the different CSVs in R or Python or your programming language of choice. And that is a dump of all of the data in CPDat, again, as of the August 13th, public release. That has been helpful for certain folks who are looking to process the data in a high throughput way, want to aggregate data on thousands and thousands of chemicals. It allows you to just pull all that data in to whatever other model or program that you're using. And the easier way to explore the data and to get at, more specific subsets of the data or data on a particular chemical is to go through the dashboard itself. The other benefit of going through the dashboard itself is that this is the data that's updated and as we curate additional data and add additional data. The download is obviously a static version as of the date that it was posted. So if you're interested in searching by chemical, you can go to the chemicals option up above the search bar and start typing your chemical of choice. It will give you a list of chemicals that it thinks you are interested in. And once you select the chemical that you are interested in, it brings you to what I call the chemical landing page, where you can find a lot of information about the chemical, again, described last month. What we're going to talk about today is the exposure tab here, which is where you can access the CPDat data and other exposure data as well. So if you click on this first menu item under the exposure tab, you're brought to the product and use categories information. So this is when we talked about both the broad categorization of chemical use and also the consumer product specific categorizations of chemical use. You can see here all of the various consumer products that hexadecanoic acid is contained in, and at the bottom of that table you can see an example of one of the, it's called CPDat cassette under categorization type, and that means that it's one of those broad categorizations of chemical use that came from a source that was not specifically related to a consumer product. The second option, menu option under the exposure tab is for the chemical weight fractions. This provides that quantitative information on weight fraction of the chemical in a specific product. So now we're not aggregating up to product category. We're talking about any individual product. You can see products here where the data type is listed as MSDS in the first row, which means that the information was reported on a material safety data sheet, typically provided by the manufacturer, and this is what they reported, that hexadecanoic acid was present in this range of weight fraction values. You also see in this table data from the EPA suspect screening research. That's the research I described where products are purchased and ground up or dissolved in the laboratory, and we look for chemicals and try and measure how much of the chemical is in the product. So all of the different ways that we obtain weight fraction data is all pulled into this one table. And then lastly, the third menu item under the exposure tab is on chemical functional use, providing information on the potential functional role of the chemical in its use. I'm not going to get into this too much because just a few months ago, Catherine Phillips gave a CompTox Communities of Practice webinar specifically on the functional use information, and that is also still available on the website. So if you want to get the details on the functional use, there's a whole webinar just on that. So the other option for searching the data on the dashboard is to go to the product and use categories search. This is actually really exciting. This is a relatively new feature available on the dashboard that a number of people have been asking for, including ourselves. You know, as exposure scientists, we often are interested in going in and looking at data by the use, the product category or the use, rather than by the single chemical. So this is very exciting to have this available now. What this allows you to do is, again, start to enter, you know, what category you might be interested in. For example, color. This brings up all of the different categories that contain the word color. You'll see that there's two different types of categories. You have the option to choose. What's listed as the CPDat use category is that broad categorization of chemical use. Look down to that, the bottom where the example is, you know, CPDat use category colorant, very general categorization. Or you can select one of the CPDat product categories, which gives you a specific type of consumer product, personal care, hair color. Both of those come up in the search. Select what you're interested in, and then it brings you to a page of all of the chemicals that are associated with, in this case, the broad use category for colorant, and you can click on any individual chemical to dive into the details, or you can download the information on the upper left and, you know, decide what information is most important to you and then use it in your work. So that is, that's sort of the two main ways that we have to access the data, the downloads on the CompTox dashboard page, the zip file download, and then, you know, accessing the data directly through the dashboard itself. I wanted to just touch on some work that we have going on here that we've been working on this past year that is somewhat internal, but will help you to understand what we have coming and what we are going to be able to provide in the coming months because of work that we have going on sort of behind the scenes. So we've been working on a internal data management tool, and again, I kind of give a sneak peek here, but it's really a tool that's meant more to help us manage the data. You can imagine that with the quantity of data that we have and the number of data points, we just have too much data to manage in spreadsheets and such, and we really needed a system for managing the data more efficiently. We also needed a system due to the quantity of data we have for doing curation of the data, adding more data in, getting new data out onto the dashboard, tracking data and its provenance, et cetera. So that's something that we've been working on and are hoping to you know, sort of link up with the data, with the CompTox dashboard in coming months, and that will allow us to push a lot more new data to the dashboard. So what we have coming, what we have in our internal tool and will be coming to the dashboard hopefully soon, is we have much more information on the products. When we have a product, we're now collecting, when it's available, the UPC for the product, which allows us to link the data over to other types of data sources. For example, sales and purchasing data, where we may be able to know, you know, what a particular family or household purchased in a given month. Sometimes you have that data available just by UPC. That's not helpful for us in our exposure modeling unless we're able to link that UPC over to what products and what chemicals were in the products that the family purchased. We have better methods for assigning the product categories that will allow us to do that more efficiently and thus to do it for more data points more quickly, which allows us to get the data out to the public more quickly. We have a link to the original data source, which is really important, particularly for our program offices, to allow them to track the exact provenance of the data. Again, remembering back at the beginning when we talked about increased data transparency, for any data point, they would be able to pull up the original source of that data and verify not only that the data point was transcribed correctly, but show exactly where it came from, which is really, really important for EPA. We also have improved methods for data QA and tracking QA, which just allows us to, again, provide data that's of improved quality through the dashboard. So this is really exciting for us. Again, a lot of behind-the-scenes work, but will hopefully allow the users of the dashboard to see much more data and much higher level of data quality in the data that they're accessing through the dashboard. So what's next? If you think about what's currently available in the public version of the database, I said there were 16,000 products and in that range of 30 to 60,000 chemicals, depending on how you count what's a unique chemical. With the data that we have in progress that we're getting ready to push to the dashboard, we have information on over 100,000 products. So we're just drastically increasing the number of products that we're able to provide data on. Unfortunately, I'm not able to say right now what the new number will be for how many chemicals we're going to cover with the increased amount of products data we have because of the process I described of chemical curation. That is ongoing. I can say it will be more than what's available now, and we just continue to do curation every day of the chemicals to increase the number of chemicals mapped to that DTX SID. The currently available data is limited to formulations, as we described, things that you purchase in a bottle and use up. In the data we have in progress, we've focused on increasing the product scope for the composition data, going beyond the categories where we have the bulk of our data, trying to add new product categories, add things like building materials and articles when we can get data on them. We're going to be doing a revisiting of those broad use category terms. That's a little bit farther off in terms of being available, but we've learned a lot since the initial round when we did that. We have the consumer product categories assigned to products in the currently available version of the database, but we have this improved, revised set of product categories that has been developed in the past year, and that's, again, has a manuscript associated with it that's being submitted, and those new sets of product categories will be rolled out in the coming months. And then, as I described, due to the work we've been doing behind the scenes, there's been additional QA of the data to increase data quality, additional mapping of chemicals, chemical curation, which allows us to increase the number of, or increase the scope of chemical coverage. And because of the behind-the-scenes work we've been doing, we're going to have an improved ability to update data that's available on the dashboard, both to correct errors if we might find them, but also to add data to the dashboard more quickly and efficiently. And with that, I will end there and thank all of the folks listed here and otherwise who have contributed to the many pieces of this work. Again, particularly my co-authors, Kristen Isaacs and Catherine Phillips, who were both instrumental in pulling all of this together. And we'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah, and so you can go ahead and put questions in the chat, and I will read them out for you. So just, if anyone has any questions, we'll stick around for a while.
There was already a question in the chat about how to pull out pesticides.
Oh, I think those were from last week, actually. So the chat is just the same meeting room that we have, so those are the questions from the last meeting that we had.
Okay. There was one about product and use.
Was there?
Oh,
Product
yeah, no, this is a new one. Yeah.
Product and use categories under exposure.
Where is that?
Yeah. Okay. Hi, Rose. Yeah,
Oh.
no, Kristen's, yeah, that is a new one. Thank you, Kristen.
And then there was a question about how to pull out pesticides.
Okay. I'm looking at this question from Rose now, so I'll address that one first. In product and use categories under exposure, is it possible to obtain the reference information supporting what's listed there? Yes and no. Oh, you answered. Oh, okay.
But you can read it after.
Oh, I don't see your response. Oh, okay. All right, yeah, we'll go with that. If anybody, Kristen Isaacs has responded to that question. Sorry, we're all catching up here in the room. Kristen Isaacs responded to that question. If there's any additional questions, feel free to ask. So the other question is on pesticides. Yeah. So yes, if you want to pull out pesticides, you would want to find all of the various categories that are related to the pesticide, or that are related to pesticides. There's not one category for pesticides. There are both broad use category terms related to pesticides, and there are also consumer product category specific terms related to pesticides. Insecticides and all different types of pesticides. So you would want to pull out all of the information for the different categories related to pesticides that are relevant to your effort. That's probably an example, honestly, right now of where the bulk zip file download might be easier, because on the dashboard you can search by one product category at a time. If you can either do that and download the chemical list for every category that you want related to pesticides, or you could go to the bulk download, pull that data into R or whatnot, and then extract out or enter the list of the pesticide related categories you're interested in.
Sorry if I missed this earlier, but where do you get the bulk of your information about the composition of each of these products?
So we had a question in the room about where we get the bulk of information about the composition of the products. I wouldn't say there's one source where we get a bulk of the information. Much of the composition information comes from material safety data sheets. Those can be obtained sometimes directly from the manufacturer. They can be obtained sometimes directly from the retailer. So, someplace like Walmart or Target or something has sort of reposted the material safety data sheets that, Procter & Gamble supplies. So most of the composition information is from material safety data sheets, or safety data sheets they're now called, or ingredient lists. But again, it's sort of from lots of different sources.
There's another question I have. Earlier you mentioned in terms of how much the database says, this family bought this much stuff, and are you able to link how much they bought in terms of exposure and link it with an exposure model from John to see if it actually?
Yeah. Okay. So we had a question in the room again about a follow-up question on when I referred to how much of a product people purchase. Sorry if that wasn't clear. That data is actually not in the dashboard or in our database. I gave that as an example of how you could use our data to link to data sources like that. So you would want, if you had data on purchasing, you would be able to take our product data and then link those two together to figure out what people purchased, often by the UPC. But yeah, the purchasing data, how much of a certain product category a household purchases in a given month or year, that information is not part of our database. Do you have any other questions?
It doesn't look like anyone is typing. If anyone has any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Okay, well, it looks like no one has any questions right now. If anyone does have any follow-up questions, you can see right above Kristen's answer, I left my email in the chat. So if you just get in touch with me, I probably cannot personally answer your question, but I am happy to find someone who can. So just let me know. And I think if that is that, we can bring a close to this meeting of the Computational Toxicology Communities of Practice. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.
I wish you were 9 o'clock, not 8.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated in 5 minutes.